Today, we're just so pleased to have uh, uh, Ian and Glenn from Sycamore Equity to share with us just a great solution that they have to a problem that is all over ministry, and that is the affordability of housing, and how do we attract talent into the housing or to the ministry and still provide housing for ministers and pastors and things. So we're just so happy to have them. Before we start, though, I do want to have a quick prayer just to invite God into this meeting with us. So, Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you give us this day and every day that you give to us. Just so blessed to be a part of anything that helps expand your kingdom, Lord. And we're just happy that we've got our guests today who are here, our hosts today, our panelists. We just ask you to bless this time together and use it for your purposes to expand your kingdom and to spread the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So thank you so much. And again, we are just blessed to be able to just give this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, thanks for being here. Yeah, we've got Glenn and Ian from Sycamore Equity, and they've got a great solution here to this problem that we talked about. And so I just want to give you just a quick background on Glenn and Ian. Glenn has over 25 years of experience in the finance and tech industry, MBA from Harvard, econ degree, I think, from Stanford. Definitely can add some value here. And Ian, again, I think 3 decades. Is that right, Ian? 3 decades
Yep.
in
Right.
nonprofit ministry, pastor experience as well. So he comes from that end. So these two gentlemen together, I think, have really been able to help come together, solve a problem that's out there. And again, I won't go any more into it. I'll just turn it over to them at this point. But what they're going to do is they're going to present some information to you, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions. I, as the host, my name's Tim Lawrence. I'm with Christian Community Credit Union, and I oversee the relationships here. And again, I'll track all the questions, and there's a question and answer tab at the bottom of your Zoom. And so if you have a question, you can just type your question in there. I will see it, and I will make sure that that question gets asked of Glenn or Ian. And again, at this point, then I'll just turn it over to Glenn Bean and Ian Noyce from Sycamore Equity. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tim. We really appreciate it. It's great to be here. We appreciate you having us. Thanks for that intro. I want to add just a little bit of color to my story and kind of my why, which is toward the bottom of this page. My dad was a free church pastor in Oakland. I grew up in a parsonage while I was there, and then we moved to the Central Valley of California. And my mom was a nurse, and she made it really clear I could do anything I wanted with my life. As when I grew up, as long as it was either go into ministry or become a doctor. And I think I really disappointed her by going to business school. But after a couple of decades working in consulting and tech, I got back to real estate finance. And ultimately, I got a challenge from some of the folks at National Christian Foundation, including my co-founder Ian. To think, how can you use some of these, skills and talents and time and experience to serve the kingdom? And so that's kind of the motivation behind Sycamore Equity. We just hit our 1-year birthday. We've had a chance to serve a number of ministry workers across the country, which we're really excited about. So we'd love to tell you about our program and potentially how it could benefit you. So I'll turn it over to my co-founder, Ian Noyce.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn. And yeah, my name's Ian, and I have been involved in pastoral ministry and served as a lead pastor, church planner, associate pastor for 2 decades, campus minister, et cetera. I've been kind of across the board involved in ministry. But for the last nearly decade, I guess about 8 years, I have been working with the National Christian Foundation. So I pivoted a few years ago, and I work with pretty much coastal California. I work with our giver community. And in some ways, as Glenn and I started talking about this idea, it was just sort of a way for the world that I was in and the world that he was in to kind of overlap, to really try to contribute to more flourishing. And so I've actually been in a couple equity share arrangements with churches, and they could be a little clunky, I would say. I spent the first year when I stepped into a leadership role in a fairly large church, kind of building an equity share program to serve our staff. And it just felt like hey, could we create something that would actually make sure that nobody ever has to do that again? Spend the first year as they're acclimatizing to a new community, a new place, building a program to provide housing affordability for themselves and other staff. And so that's kind of what we've done is try to take the friction out of this system that really can be a great solution, not only for the pastors and ministry leaders, but also for the organizations that they serve. And we know that ministries attract incredible talent, that they do a great job of uh, uh, people attracting people who really have made a deliberate decision sometimes to go into work that may not have the same kind of financial rewards as other work that they might do, but they have kind of doubled down on purpose. And so we just sort of believe that just because they attract extraordinary talent, that they should still have the opportunity to be able to provide for their family and live in the communities that they serve. And in so many ways, that is what helps kind of expand and it's a ministry strategy in its own right. To be able to live in the community that you serve, to be at the grocery store, rubbing elbows with the people that you are working with. And when that doesn't happen, unfortunately, this kind of housing instability can create a lot of stress. I've experienced that stress myself and know a lot of my friends who experienced that stress over the years. And a number of people who would have shared stories with us about how that plays out and reverberates in their life. In one context I was in, I moved to a new church context to lead a congregation. And because of housing insecurity, we moved 5 times in 2 years. And that just makes for hard ministry. And in a season where you should be getting to know people and building relationships to try to figure out how to provide for your family to kind of land. And so part of what we're trying to do is solve that problem, take some of that stress out. So in that, just kind of as we started moving around in this space, we also have met a number of people and really I would love to just share sort of a story of two of them, two friends of mine, in fact, Tyler and Jonathan, who have dramatically different stories. And so part of the impetus for this, as we were kind of having our initial conversations, was to try to make sure that we accelerate and amplify Tyler's story and reduce the number of folks who have Jonathan's story. So, for example, just to kind of introduce you to both of them, Tyler is a campus pastor doing campus ministry in Oklahoma and had set up an equity share arrangement and had some different donor investors who had put money into his house and enabled him to be able to purchase a home and lived in Oklahoma and worked for nearly a decade in fruitful ministry. He recently was moving to an even more expensive area, but then what happened in his story was that over those 10 years, as he had even just a small percentage ownership in a home, it enabled and was able to springboard him into his next call in a significantly more expensive area, not only because of the equity that he had in his home, but because he had 10 years of people who'd been journeying with him. And so many of them who had deployed capital in for the purchase of his first home redeployed for the purchase of a second home. And so this became, in a sense, a seasoned investor base, in addition to his donor support base that was able to kind of carry him forward into his next call. So now meet Jonathan. Jonathan lives here. I live in Santa Barbara. Jonathan lives in Santa Barbara. He's given us permission to share his story because he also doesn't want his story to get repeated. He moved here to work in campus ministry at UCSB. When he initially moved here, he had a couple kids, was renting a place for $3,500. And at the time, he could have gotten into a home in Santa Barbara for about $800,000. At the time when we were initially talking about this, if he had raised an additional $100,000 to be able to purchase that home, he could have gotten into a house. Um, but now you fast forward, same time frame, nearly 10 years later. And now Jonathan, his rent, he's got 4 kids. His rent is north of $5,000. It's actually closely approaching $6,000. And to be able to get into a home now, it would require significantly more. In fact, it's probably closer to 1.4 million to get into a house in Santa Barbara. So it just has brought it out of reach. But what also happened is he's had to raise an additional $100,000 nearly a year to be able to just support his ongoing ministry. So in some ways, those two stories just give you a sense that this is in a lot of ways about asset allocation and about just thinking wisely and thinking ahead. And this is a story that we would love to just sort of, again, see more Tylers and fewer Jonathans so that they can step more fully into the ministry future. the other sort of unseen part of Jonathan's story is that it has created a lot of stress in their family, and in some ways, a bit of a crisis of calling. And like, can he continue to do this, even though he feels animated and energized by ministry calling? Just the financial strain to be able to do that in an area like Santa Barbara has been really difficult. And yet here is this person who's invested 10 years of his life to be able to do this. And in some ways, that depth of relationship, we just believe that longevity can be a great ministry strategy. And this is a retraction and retention kind of approach. So that's a big part of why we did this. So a little bit of a longer introduction, but you know these statistics, you live them and see them, and housing costs have increased at a significant rate. And so it used to be that you maybe 4 times your salary could get you into a house. And now across the country, it's closer to 6 times your salary. So you can see on the bottom, the rate of salary increases is fairly minimal, kind of a low angle, but the cost of housing, the median price of housing has gone up dramatically. And if you play these out, you can just imagine that these gaps are going to get significantly larger. This is the national average, but if you look at a particular region like California, where I live, you start to see that these numbers get even more extreme. That in Santa Barbara, where I live, it would take 10x your salary to be able to purchase a home. San Luis Obispo, 9. San Bernardino, et cetera. You kind of get the sense that these two lines are not getting close. They're not moving closer to each other. They're moving further away. And so there is a crisis really of housing affordability. And we also just sort of recognize this as an opportunity to step into the moment that we have. We've both been kind of encouraged to see how younger generations are encouraged to ask questions about Christian faith. I see it in my own kids and their generation. And we want to really position people to be able to minister to that generation, and for that generation to be able to purchase homes. And we're concerned about that. And so that's part of why we started Sycamore Equity, was to make sure that the next generation, the current generation, that everyone who is called to ministry can afford to live in the communities that they serve. And so that's why we created Sycamore Equity. And I'm going to turn over to Glenn to kind of share with you a little bit more about the mechanics. But hopefully you get a sense of our passion for this. We just think it's unacceptable, really, for us to not be able to solve this problem when it really is just about sort of structure, organization, and asset allocation. The resources are there. It's simply about where we put them and how we apply them. So, Glenn?
Great. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, with this backdrop, we saw a lot of friction in the system, and a lot of, disappointed stakeholders ultimately, when they weren't able to attract and retain the right talent. And then, of course, when the ministry workers just say, well, this is not a field I can go into, stay into, or I've been in it, and just having this stress about retirement, kind of across the board. And so we bring together 3 key stakeholders to solve this problem and have an innovative solution. We want a bit of a listening tour to hear how churches were trying to address it. And the short answer is not super well. A few churches have solutions that worked okay. Some weren't always conforming to IRS or SEC guidelines. And some just left a bad taste either in the homeowner's mouth, or maybe a future generation of trustees or elders, or another governing board that didn't really realize kind of what agreement had been signed up for previously. So we just want to make all that simple. And for the homeowner, we want them to be able to put down roots, to have that equity building opportunity and home ownership, the pride of home ownership. It's, I want to be in this community and I want to be here for a long time. And this is how it's really going to make an impact for the organization I'm serving, and also for my family and me. Now, for organizations who are trying to hire in a relatively hot market when wages are going up, and budgets are constrained on how much you can pay, this is an opportunity to add something as almost a benefit. It is this path to home ownership that may not have existed elsewise. And along with all the other things that you talk about, this is a key component, especially if you're moving to a community, to choose a school, to know what your commute is, to be relatively close, to be able to potentially use it for ministry. It's obviously not an obligation, but one of the folks we talked to, the very first thing we said was, well, what type of house would you like to buy? They said one that has a living room that can host a Bible study of 50. Now, that also comes with other benefits of having a living room that's that big, but just that was their instinctive answer for what they were shopping for, was really humbling and just also motivating to help put together a financing package. But then finally, the third piece is the capital formation. Ian and I will both talk about that a bit more. There are traditional resources, but there are also resources within the charitable community, and then also, advantage mortgages that can bring together this package. You don't have to do it yourself, and there are ways to, pull it together end to end and say, let's get someone into a home, and they can move on with doing the rest of what they were called to do, their actual job. All right, so let's get a little bit tactical. How does this work? Well, we've got an example from the Central Coast of California. This is Bryce. He's a happy guy. He's really happy now because he's in a house. But he was renting and the lease was coming up and he wanted to buy. He and his wife only had a modest down payment, and there was kind of this sort of Damocles where they knew they needed to get something done within a few months. But they were committed to the church. He's the head pastor up in San Luis Obispo, and they've been there a few years. They know they want to be there for 5, 10, 15 more years as their kids, age, move on to college, etc. They're making a big commitment. And they had a little bit of wiggle room on the monthly payment. But houses, in coastal California are just expensive. So we did a quick assessment and said, okay, let's start with what you have. You've got the down payment, as you mentioned. And then, he talked to a mortgage provider and they said, given your income, debt to income ratio, credit score, all that type of stuff, all through the traditional process, here's what you would qualify for. And as they were shopping, knowing how many children they had, where they wanted to live, etc., this is what they would need. And this is a really technical term that I've learned in finance, that left a gap. And it just wasn't even close. This is not drawn to scale, but there's just no chance for home ownership there unless they had something else that could come to the table besides kind of this historic American financing package of down payment and the qualifying mortgage. And so the way that they filled the gap, and this is their real example, is a combination of capital that effectively extended the down payment and reduced the total mortgage that they needed to have. So they still brought about 10% themselves, and they still qualified for about a 60% mortgage on the house. And then we helped them assemble a fund, some of which did come from the church. The church already had reserves, and so they became an investor in the fund, and they saw it as a bit of a mini housing endowment. So when Bryce either refis or sells the home and pays it back, that'll be available for the next pastor. And whether it's a head pastor, an associate pastor, or, we've gotten communications directors, children's pastors, missions pastors. It doesn't have to be limited to a single, job title, and maybe historically someone who would have had a parsonage. Second, we worked with a few accredited investors in their congregation and said, this is an asset that you can invest in. It has modest returns, but it has some returns. And, right now the S&P 500 index has relatively volatile returns. So this has real estate style returns, kind of slow and steady, 10-ish year horizon. Would you be interested in shifting some money from, say, your brokerage account into an asset like this? And there were a number of folks who said, yeah, absolutely, I can put money to work for that. I'm not ready to donate it to the church, but I'm thinking about my balance sheet now rather than my giving. And then finally, there are some folks who had balances in a donor advised fund. So it's already charitable capital. They've already gotten a tax deduction, or some actually got a tax deduction in that particular year. But now they have that capital that they will give away one day, but for now they can use it as an investment in this home. And they're seeing that as sort of that impact investing of serving their community and serving the overall mission of the organization, while also getting a return on their charitable capital. And that's how all the pieces came together. Now, why does this work? Well, it's kind of the rule of thumb on home ownership. When Bryce and his family came in, they had some equity. It eliminates mortgage insurance, which is a huge cost savings. It reduces their monthly payment. So especially if you're self-fundraising or just looking at a budget of a nonprofit, that cost is still really beneficial. They can grow equity over time. Even if it's at a modest pace, they are paying down the principal and they get to participate as the asset appreciates. And then, of course, pride of home ownership, all the sort of intangibles we talked about, choosing where you live, your commute, the school, etc. Oops. And so just from a financial perspective, this setup in California will typically save an individual somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 a month on housing costs, or about 25 to 40% of total housing costs. That number can vary based on a couple of factors, but that just sort of gives you a sense of the hurdle you can overcome. But it also works for the investors. In this example, investing about $200,000 with a bit of appreciation and some of the other terms that go with it, you could target somewhere in the neighborhood of a 5 to 7% IRR. It can appreciate over time. So then you say in year 6, in year 10, et cetera, when the funds are actually returned, now this money that we invested is indexed to the price of real estate in our community, and it'll grow at that pace so that future generations now could potentially have access to these funds, or of course they could be returned and used for something else. So Sycamore Equity provides the end-to-end fund and flow management for all of this. First, we have all the legal contracts in place. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. We think it's important that things are done with excellence and everything's sort of buttoned up state by state and all the implications that go along with that. And so that's just an out-of-the-box package that we hope is pretty easy. And it even includes things like a conflict of interest policy, as it's really important that nonprofits follow certain rules to make sure that they're not in violation of private endearment rules. We can also provide some coaching to the donor and investor base. So we will communicate, what is this program? What does it look like? What are the terms? And it's unlocking those sources of capital that may not necessarily come to mind sort of in some of the historic model. As the assets are originated, we'll manage them over time, provide the servicing, K-1s, tax documents, reporting. We'll pick up the phone and answer questions that either investors or the home buyer has, and then ultimately work through the transaction execution itself. We have some preferred lenders and some preferred realtors who are mission aligned and understand what we're trying to do. They understand the instrument, and it just makes it all turnkey and taken care of, a lot of legwork that organizations don't have to take on their own. So a first step when we work with an employer is to go through a fund design process. This is really important. You can kind of see some of the key questions we work through. It's both strategic and tactical. It's strategic in the sense of, hey, what are we trying to accomplish here? And some organizations, if they say, well, they're just 1 or 2 staff members, we'd love to get into homes. Okay, great. Let's talk about those and how can we work toward that end. But larger organizations oftentimes think about, is it my management population, or is it based on years of service, or am I trying to fill some key roles or plant a church in a new location? So anyhow, walking through what are we really trying to get done here? What type of capital sources are available to us and how do we tap into them? What do the returns look like for those investors? What type of assets will we invest in? And ultimately, how much money are we trying to raise? And this gets alignment both for the organization, but again, some of it goes into the tactical legal documents. So this is a relatively fast conversation to have. Usually we can knock out some of the key terms. We'll have an intro call and then maybe walk through some of this in about an hour with folks who are looking at the financing and the hiring strategy, and we can provide some best practices that we've seen across the board. Right now, we're actively investing in 5 different states, but we've got a pipeline in over 20 states. And as an example, we just lit up Michigan this week in Grand Rapids. And this is one of the things that's so great about our sort of informal partnership with NCF. Grand Rapids isn't part of a major metro area. They don't actually have their own NFL team. And as that church is thinking through the sources of financing available, either Ian could easily pick up the phone or one of Ian's colleagues who actually covers the Michigan area would be able to step in, coach the investors and talk through the, particularly the tax questions and the donor advised fund implications if they're to use those alternate sources of capital to ultimately achieve their mission. So we're excited to be able to offer this in a lot of places and ultimately, further kingdom purposes as much as we can. So maybe I'll pause there. That's kind of an overview of what we offer and how we offer it. And we're happy to take a few questions. And of course, we can always have follow-up as well.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you so much, Ian. Appreciate great information. There are a few questions that I think maybe can help clarify some things. Let me get to some of these here. First one I have here is, can we self-administer this program?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's the first question that we get asked so often, especially in churches. There are often talented folks who have some experience in real estate, law, finance, etc. And what we found over the past couple decades is a lot of churches have tried to with varying levels of success. And so the answer is yes, you can. And we think that we can take some of the friction out of the system, just make it easier. We have a package of legal documents that are just ready to go, a legal team, both on the charitable side, the real estate side, and the finance side that can answer questions. We have a model that's been used in the past. We will administer the assets in the process. We bring a preferred network of lenders and can facilitate with the investors and just sort of end to end. We've invested a lot of this legwork to make it really easy. We actually had a church here in Colorado that was pretty interested in setting up a fund for about 6 folks. And we started talking to them about a year ago. And, we got close to setting up a fund. No, we didn't. And that's fine. And, they looked into it themselves. And I got a call about a month ago from the same elder I'd been working with. And he said, Glenn, I know we haven't talked to you in 6 months. I think we just wasted 6 months. We've come back to the conclusion we should have just hired you in the first place because this is a hassle. This is a lot of work, and we just don't want to do this. And he said, it is such a relief to know that you will just be administering this on our behalf. So that's one, small anecdote. And of course, if you have, the expertise and a relatively narrow focus, you ought to look at all the resources that you can call on. But we think we provide a pretty useful service and a scaled service that can be for small organizations all the way up to very large employers.
Great. Cool. Next question. Can you explain a little bit more about the capital that comes into the table? Does Sycamore bring equity, or is it? I guess maybe a little bit more about the donor advised funds. Just a little bit more clarity on that.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take this one, Glenn. I think Sycamore Equity does not at this time bring capital to these deals, but what we do is help you sort of think through how to access different sources of capital in the community that you're serving. So in a church context or a ministry context, there are people who probably give to the ministry and make grants to the ministry and support the work, the ongoing work of the church or ministry. And this is really a different way of supporting that work. And so when it particularly relates to a donor advised fund, a donor advised fund is sort of like a giving checking account that kind of delinks you get the tax deduction in the year of the gift, but then you can take time granting it out. What sometimes happens is folks who may have sort of nonlinear income and boom years and bust years or liquidity events or things like that. This is a way for them to set aside often larger resources, larger numbers and dollars to kind of for ongoing giving. But sometimes they don't grant it all out at the same time. And so this is a way to kind of access some of that balance. And so part of what we do is help to educate organizations about the donors that they may already have. They may not even know have donor advised funds. In the case that was Glenn shared initially about Bryce. I don't think Bryce and even some of the leaders in the church weren't aware of that there was a whole segment of their congregation that actually already had donor advised funds or was looking to think about more than just cash flow giving, thinking about how they could do balance sheet giving, sort of net worth giving, and saw this as an opportunity to be able to support their church get a return, and deploy some of this charitable capital that might just be sitting in index funds in their DAF. And so what we do and the way it works is that in a donor advised fund, you've already gotten the tax deduction. And then what we enable people to do is, in addition to Sycamore Equity, we have Sycamore Foundation. So they can actually make a grant from their donor advised fund, be it at the National Christian Foundation or wherever they have those funds. They can make a grant then to Sycamore Foundation, which then makes a donor directed investment into a particular property. So in the example that we shared before, some funds came from the church invested. Funds came from donor advised funds through Sycamore Foundation to invest, and then some funds came just as a straight up investment. All of those funds get held and aggregated into an LLC, and then that LLC makes an investment in a particular property or properties. And so that's kind of how it works, and it's all it all sort of works on the front end, but then it also is important on the back end, because then when the house sells or the refinances, then everything goes back to the original source. The church gets their funds back with appreciation. The donor advised fund holders, individuals who had invested, and goes to Sycamore Foundation, and then Sycamore Foundation grants it back to their donor advised funds that they can then re-grant to any ministry they want to, or redeploy for pastor next or leader next. And then the investor gets their money back plus appreciation. So this is kind of the mechanism. And what we do is sort of come alongside and help educate a donor base or an organization about how they can communicate this opportunity and the mechanism for it, and so that people can feel good about knowing that there is a clear pathway both into the fund and back out as well.
And I think Glenn mentioned this earlier, but so has it been your experience as, I know churches, there's they have capital campaigns for different things, right? And I know sometimes that, they get a little worn out sometimes when there's lots of projects, right? But has it been a little, has this been a little bit easier perhaps, or are you approaching the same people that normally give as saying, hey, perhaps maybe you can't give now, but maybe, maybe you can invest here. And how is that, gone?
Tim, that's a great question. And I would just say that, I mean, it's not necessarily that these are different people, but they are accessing a different source of resources that they've had. And so I spend a good bit of my time working with donors. And churches, even the data points out, I mean, Dr. James Russell and others have done a lot of research in this analysis. Churches are actually great at getting small gifts. And if you look at all the data, I think, in most nonprofits, maybe 0.3% of your donor base gives 50% of the support that you need.
Wow.
In churches, that same number, it's actually 14%.
Wow.
That doesn't mean that so particularly like wealthier donors, it's not that they're not generous, it's that they're not necessarily giving large gifts to their church. They're supporting churches, but they're not making these big kind of capital gifts. They are doing it elsewhere, though. Where there are other opportunities maybe to have a bigger impact. And sometimes it's because they don't want the church to be unnecessarily dependent upon them or things like that. But this actually opens up that conversation with those donors to say, hey, you have, 6 figures, 7 figures in a donor advised fund. You're giving, your $20,000 a year because you don't want to build overly dependent kind of is appropriate. You want everybody to be able to support the ministry of the church. But those same folks who give to the church but don't give in this way now have an imagination for how they can support the ministry of the church, deploy these resources that they're not ready to give to the church, but they are willing to offer to the church for the furthering of its ministry and the support of pastoral leaders. A different way to engage existing donors. And in the example that we shared of Bryce, they were a little bit anxious about this. They raised $500,000 in 2 months.
Wow.
And that was like capital, kind of major capital kind of fundraising campaign for this church. I think they were astounded and surprised at actually how quickly it went, just because it was a different pocket, so to speak, or a different sort of pool of resources that donors have. So that's a great question.
Okay. Next question, who actually owns the home?
So the staff member owns the home. They're on title by themselves. It's not a tenant in common setup. And so as a result, they're also responsible for paying homeowners insurance, paying property taxes, mowing the lawn, etc., changing the light bulbs. So there's not a property management component. The work crew should not plan to go over there and do any sort of maintenance. It's a second piece of financing akin to the first mortgage. It has a second lien. And so it's passive in that regard. The staff member owns the home, and that's part of what entitles them to the upside of the equity as the home appreciates.
Yeah, that's a good question. Oh, this is a good one too. What happens if the person leaves the organization?
Yeah. So in this particular model, we have structured this in such a way that this is a benefit that's tied to employment. So it's an employer-sponsored program. And so as a result, when someone leaves an organization, it's a part of the conversation we'd have on the fund design side, on the front end of this, to say what kind of time frame is there for the return of capital. Our starting point is 6 months. We sort of believe that sort of shorter than that can sometimes unduly stress the situation. Longer than that can also kind of unduly stress the situation. And if we're talking about churches, churches aren't typically calling pastors in a 6 month time period anyway. So like to give time for things to unwind, school years to end, things like that, that's typically where we start in terms of returning capital. And again, it could be a refi or a sale. And one of the things about this is where like having, and just speaking from experience, this is where having like a third party can also be helpful. We all sort of enter into these agreements and relationships with the hope that everything's going to go swimmingly and everybody's very hopeful at the outset. But I imagine if we've been around church or ministry for any length of time, we also know that sometimes these things don't always sort of unwind in ways that are ideal. And so in those kinds of situations, if there's an HR sort of, process in place or something like that, the church doesn't have to get mired in the untangling the housing piece of it. They can just run their HR process and then wait for the check. And we manage and engage with the homeowner and help facilitate the transaction or the process that needs to be done there. Now, the length of time could be longer, it could be shorter, but we spell all that up front. And our starting point is of a conversation for the template is kind of like 6 months is kind of where we like to start. But yeah, that's how it works.
Okay. Yeah, so it sounds like really from the pastor who gets the house, from their point of view, it's their house, right? They can improve the house. From their perspective, it's just like home ownership. It's just creative financing then, right? So they can improve the house. They got to make those payments, right? On that mortgage, all those different things, right? This is their house. There's just a period of time where there's, an agreement, they've got to stay there to keep that equity. And I'm sure those details you guys can, add a little bit to that detail.
They are spelled out, and particularly as it speaks to improvements, we have a mechanism to create credits for capital improvements to the property. That's all spelled out in the documents as well. And this is where kind of our model versus a tenants in common agreement or something like that. It's like, well, who pays for the improvements and what percentage and what about sweat equity? And we have all that spelled out. And as the there's just a single owner. So I don't know, Glenn, if you want to add anything to that, but.
I think that's it. That's all I was going to share is we try to be as fair as possible. And if you make the asset more valuable, yeah, you get credit for it.
Okay. Now, what about the opposite? What happens if the market comes crashing down a little bit? What happens then?
Yep. Well, this is a great time to have one of my favorite sentences and also our disclaimer slide. Past performance is no indication of future success, and this is a risky asset that could go either up or down. And so there is a reality here that we've seen in memory that the housing market can go down, and people ought to know that and understand that anyone who would participate in this, whether an employer, a traditional investor, or a charitable capital investor. And so what that means is if the market goes down and the homeowner sells, the amount invested could be coming back, could be flat, or could even go down. You know, $100,000 invested could come back as 90 or 95,000. So that's partly offset by the 100,000 invested could come back as 120 or 140,000. You know, there is upside as well. But a couple other dimensions here are, well, one, what about the work that's done in the time, you know, while that person was living in the home? There's some of that value there. Another, I guess, consideration is, and a lot of investors have been so generous, they acknowledge, you know, I am both investing in this property and I'm buying some of this risk. If the homeowner were to go out and get a 97.3 mortgage or a 95.5 mortgage or a 90.10, which are products that are available, they're just more expensive. They're also riskier, and that means that home buyer would be taking on that entire downside risk themselves. And so a lot of people say, I know that I'm both getting this person to the home, but I'm also buying some of that risk, and that's part of my gift to them. And you know, we have some stats that show it is a risky asset, and there's no 10-year period, including peak to trough in the Great Financial Crisis, that did not have positive home appreciation. That's part of the reason why homes cost so much now in America. But it has historically been a slow and steady, kind of boring, positive grower. And so that's kind of the asset attribute. But anyone who'd be considering this would need to be well versed in the dynamics of the industry and make that decision.
So just again, just to clarify, how does the investor get their fund back mechanically? How does that work?
Yep. So the most common triggers are if the home is sold or refinanced. So say after, you know, average home ownership is 7-ish years, but say you have a flourishing employee for 10 or even 15 years. And again, that's part of the terms we can set up in the financing. If they sell their home, then, you know, the first chunk of money goes to pay back the first mortgage. The second chunk of money goes back to pay for this shared equity option investment agreement. And then the remainder goes to the home buyer. That's the equity for them. If rates go down, which I'm not here to tell you whether rates will go up or down, but if they build a bit of equity into the home by paying down the principal and rates were to go down, they could refinance. And the first thing they can refinance out is the second position and pay the fund back. So those are the most common ways to get the money returned.
Excellent. I don't see any other questions. Is there anything, Glenn and Ian, that you want to make sure, any questions that were not asked or anything that you want to clarify?
I think this is kind of run it end to end for us. You know, we're so honored to be able to share with you and some of your members the services we're offering. We're actively working with CCCU on a deal right now for a pastor in Pasadena, which has just been a wonderful experience for everybody involved. You know, and our hearts are really in a position so that we can serve more people to bridge that gap getting into home ownership. So we're happy to have follow-up emails or, you know, hop on a call to understand someone's individual context.
Thanks. And Ian, anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, I mean, I think I would just say that I think part of the way that we've built this is that it works for sort of a one-off, you know, a church that just needs to get one person to a house. It works for multi-staff where there may be, you know, multiple staff that you're trying to kind of get into home. We actually are also in conversations right now with an entire city that is looking to stand up a fund to serve sort of targeted ministry professionals to address particular needs in a community. One to serve pastors and ministry leaders that might not have access to the same kind of affinity capital investors, and another one that's focused on next gen leaders, sort of youth to young adults. So it's a malleable tool, and I guess on the one hand, I'm not sure exactly who the audience here, if it's church leaders or ministry leaders, but this can be scaled up or down, and that's what's sort of so beautiful about it. And obviously, if scaled up, there's another potential liquidity mechanism in there. The bigger the fund, you have multiple assets owned by that fund. You have multiple transactions happening at the same time, and it actually creates a little different kind of fund flow. And in time, we hope to be able to utilize that in ways that can create a little bit more liquidity potentially, or address issues where there might be some extraneous circumstances where somebody needs, say, more time to exit a home, or it's just like 6 months, they need an extra 3 to just kind of get to the end of the school year. This is our heart. We're building this to really serve ministries and ministry leaders, because we believe that thriving ministry leaders create thriving communities, and thriving communities is right now what we probably need more than just about anything else. And so it's sort of our pathway into this, and a desire to kind of step into into this space in a way that has a bit more of a redemptive vision, and just really solves a real need. So it's been exciting to be a part of, and we're so grateful for the opportunity to work with you and others to help bring this to churches and ministries. So,
Well, thanks, Ian. And you know what? I see this vision. I think it's a great idea. We obviously, as a credit union, think it's a great idea, and we're looking forward to partnership with you on this. And again, I just want to encourage everybody who's watching this webinar is just to share this this idea, because I think in the 20+ years I've been in working with ministries, I've seen this need firsthand a lot. And so I know that need is out there. And so I just want to encourage everybody that's watching this just to that this idea is out there, and to contact Glenn and Ian, and they can contact you through the website then at Sycamore Equity.
Yeah, our website or info@sycamoreequity.com. Either of those are pretty easy to get a hold of us.
Great. Well, again, thanks for being here. Thanks everyone for watching this webinar, and we're thrilled to have this opportunity to help folks. And again, thanks for being here.